everyone, welcome back to another installment of the Vermont leg of our journey here on Art in Action. I hope you've all been well. So as I mentioned in the last video, one of the big questions for this part of the project for me is, what does it look like to make art in a rural area like Vermont, where there often isn't the same kind of cultural zeitgeist or density of museums and art schools and just an art scene in general that you would find in a metropolitan area like New York or San Francisco or any other city? How do artists build a sense of community here? What challenges do they face? What do they love about working here? Where do they find inspiration? So, to help me find some answers to these questions, I interviewed Amy Morel, who is an artist based in Barnard, Vermont. Amy combines welding and collage to create these intricate sculptures that pull from the world around her. She grew up across the country outside of Seattle, Washington, before moving to Hanover, New Hampshire, which is just on the border of Vermont, to study fine art at Dartmouth College. After Dartmouth, Amy spent time in both Boston and New York to continue her studies in graduate school, and her work often explores the relationships to these different places and how they coexist and inform her sense of self and her place in the world, especially her relationship to the West Coast and Vermont and the sort of dichotomy that exists there. I was curious to hear Amy's thoughts on this theme of place and belonging, and I also really wanted to learn what working and living in Vermont has been like for her. We ended up having a really interesting conversation, and I'm really grateful that she took the time to speak with me, and yeah, just really appreciate her wisdom. And I'm excited to share what I learned with you guys. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so to start, could you just talk a little bit about your journey as an artist?
Oh, yeah.
And what are your first memories of making art? And like, did you grow up around artists, or what was sort of your exposure?
Yes. Didn't grow up around a lot of like working artists. I think the first time like I had that kind of feeling of like, ooh, I made something that people are resonating with was we lived on Lake Washington, which is a lake in Seattle, and it's pretty heavily used lake, and I walked along the edge of it and was just picking up essentially trash, and then took it up to the house and like on a windowsill just kind of like laid it out almost like taxonomically, like sort of by color or by shape, and I just made this arrangement, and it was super satisfying to me, like the gathering, the arranging, and then the looking at it. But I also had this like in the back of my mind of like, this is weird, this is just trash. But then like I would show it to people, like just in my family, and they liked it, and you know, they responded to it in a way that was not just like, oh honey, that's a nice drawing, you know. It was like there was something about it that they got.
Yeah.
And I feel like to me that was the first time that I was like, oh, like I mean, maybe not consciously, but like, oh, these strange little impulses that I have, if I enact them, there's a feedback loop with other people that somehow they're receiving it on a level that's beyond words. And then fast forward to college, walking out of my collage class with Verge Bogosian, where he would just, you know, be looking at all of our work and finding beautiful stuff in it, and then stepping out into the world and just seeing the world through those eyes. I'm like, oh my God, that fire hydrant is gorgeous, you know, and like, and having like, oh, if art's in your life, then you're able to have this lens on the world where you can actually find beauty in things that aren't technically, you know, meant to be beautiful, just because you have this sensibility. And then also at the end of college, I think kind of what sealed the deal for me was we had the Artist Award ceremony, and Tony Kushner came to speak. Oh, wow. And he's an amazing guy, and he started his talk out with a litany of all the stuff that was going on in the world, which as now, it was horrific. It was like 1995, and stuff is going down as it is going down now. And he said that, how could we deign to be making art and when the world is, doing this? And he's like, because artists show that the human impulse is not just about destruction. It's about, if we can make something that's using this side of ourselves and creating beauty, and then that gives people hope for humanity.
Yeah.
Because it's like, we're not just about our wars. And so I felt like, oh, well, that is important.
Yeah.
And I can make that a reason for being an artist. So
what did you notice that was different when you moved to Hanover? About like the two different environments.
It's still a colonialist architecture, but it is very, there's a New England architectural look, kind of, and from that would be the 1700s, 1800s. And out on the West Coast, it's like a total hodgepodge, right?
Yeah.
And you get some New Englandy type stuff, and you also get like Spanish colonial, and you get, 1970s modern ranch. And so it's like very hodgepodgey, but I liked how I could see the architecture was an expression of culture. And it's beautiful, obviously, and the kind of the uniformity of it, I think I really visually resonated with me, but also that it was so old. I like, and
that's true.
Obviously, we're on occupied land, right? Like it's older than our colonialist, footprint, but this having a visual, record of this older thing, and also that like going out into the woods and seeing these stone walls and realizing like, oh, we're already in a place where people have been and left. With New York, it's like, it's the diversity, right? It's like you're stepping out into a collage. It's just like, it's so saturated with color. It's so saturated with, I was thinking about like when I lived there after graduation, like the parades, there would be a Puerto Rican parade, but a Dominican parade, but a like, German heritage parade, like, and all these people like expressing their culture, like in this beautiful, celebratory way, and that the city is just sort of designed to receive that, and like, and celebrate that. And I loved that kind of saturation, and but also just how much is going on there. And then I would say, the Upper Valley, it's just, it's got this stuff going on in there, but I think one of the things that draws people to this area is their ability to, sequester themselves in space. And so, getting anywhere, you're driving 45 minutes. So it's like you don't have that feeling of togetherness. I think in order to access it, just effort, and there's just more spaciousness. But whereas in New York, you're being bombarded by culture, color, materials. Like here, you're being bombarded by, the outside world, and you're saturated by that. And I do love how you can experience the seasons here, because it's a different palette. It's like we're looking at green now, but give us 6 months and it'll be white. It is really nice to be able to like be here making work and quiet the noise, because and it's overwhelming just how many artists there are working in New York. So you sort of feel like, well, what I think it's more difficult to have an ear for your own voice, because there's so much great work there and so many people expressing themselves. It's like, well, whereas, definitely here you have the space and the quietness, I guess, to listen for that more. So, but then of course it's like, well, you gotta, how do you get the work to there?
And then what do you find challenging about making art here?
Well, the finding community, and just that how you have to kind of really be proactive about that. The isolation factor is real. But also just seeing work. You're having to travel. Like when I was in New York and was looking at all those, like going to see a bunch of different work, you sort of get a sense of like, oh, there's like a little bit of a zeitgeist here, like in the sense of like there are undercurrents that I'm feeling in the work that are like of this time. And I feel like when there's not enough of a critical mass of work that you can see near you, it's hard to feel like, oh, what's going on? You know, like what's the vibe of all the work? Like what are we talking about right now? Like I guess it's harder to have a conversation with the work, because it's like not a conversation with words, but it's harder to have like all the work have a conversation, because there's just not as much of it.
And then, do you mind just talking a little bit about your West Coast, East Coast kind of identity?
Oh yeah, I read that question that you asked, and it's like I realized like I think about this so much.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that I did until you asked that question. I'm like, there's some element about it that I think about it like, I don't know, almost every day.
Yeah, because you said you don't consider yourself like an East Coast artist. Or do you still feel that way?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I just, and I feel like, I don't know, just like, but I feel like in a way, like the human condition is about displacement in a way. You know, it's like, yes, like for me, it's about like West Coast and East Coast, but it's also like, I feel like we're always, somehow separated from source in a way, whether it's spiritually or physically, or just like I feel like there's something about the human condition that's kind of longing for getting back to something. And I do. I mean, I think being from somewhere and being really tied to that place and not living there is something that fuels me, and I think about it. And culturally, like last night I was talking to somebody I hadn't seen from a while who grew up in Washington State, and it's like I felt like I was talking to my cousin. Like there's this sort of commonality. It's like I don't even know her that well, but I just felt like I knew her so well. You know, just because manner of speaking, or just like this unknown like way of being and moving through the world that feels like it's of that place. But yeah, I feel like when I go out there, and the most recent time I was out there, I'm just staring at the mountains. Like there are not snow covered peaks here 20 like year round, and I literally feel like when I'm staring at, for example, Mount Rainier in Washington State, similar to Mount Hood in Oregon, it's just like I'm getting some kind of transfusion, you know, like honestly, like I feel like there's an energy exchange that's happening, and I'm filling up in a way that is just, I can't get that here. I also think I've been learning about this kind of, I guess you'd call it modality, called internal family systems, which is a way of thinking about oneself, not as like a mono person, but as a family, an internal family of selves. And so, and you know, it's one way of processing trauma too. So they're traumatized selves, and I think there are terms for it, like the exile, and then there are selves that would protect that traumatized self. And anyway, it's thinking of oneself as a family of selves, and that kind of made me think of that the Vermont Seattle connection in a different way too. It's like, oh, like we are all, if you subscribe to that theory, which I think is super compelling to me, like we're all a bouquet of different flowers, you know, but really, like it's not, we don't have to be just one thing.
We actually don't have to reconcile.
No, we don't.
Just coexist.
We don't. And I think in a way it's like, yes, we're whole, and there's oneness, but like I think there was like learning about this way of thinking was liberating in a sense, because it's like, well, it's not wrong to have these two parts. We don't have to reconcile it. It is, and that's it feeds me, that dynamism between these two places. It doesn't have to be a longing, it's just a dynamic.
So not only is Amy an artist, but she also runs Eastman Farm with her husband, where they produce locally grown beef and pork. She also takes part in organizing Feast and Field, which hosts live music and locally grown food every week throughout the late spring and summertime at a farm in Barnard. I was curious to know if her presence in the agricultural space in Vermont intertwined with her artistic practice as well.
Being next to people who are farming, it's like that is about really being hands-on. You know, it's about really literally getting your hands dirty, but like having your hands in the earth and just physically manipulating things. And I feel like it's cool to be around that, because even though I'm not producing food, you know, I'm producing like soul food, you know, I'm like hopefully like I'm producing something that's going to feed people in a way that's not like physical sustenance. But so I do like how there is a physicality to it, and being out here, and just in, you know, kind of a ruggedness. Like I always feel like such a rock star for just surviving the winter.
Totally.
I mean, I'm like, I did another one, like I'm a badass, like so I feel like that being in a climate that's kind of hard to live in is can be confidence inspiring in a way.
Yeah, and it connects to your actual like practice. Welding, you know, is also really physical.
It's funny how, like, you know, if you do get kind of credibility, like if you say you're welding, because like people who are in farming also, like there's usually a welder in the mix because they've got to fix their equipment, and so it's like there can be like a common point of like, oh, okay, well, what kind of setup are you using? Like, oh, I'm using Oxy. Oh, yeah, you know, so it's like there's like a point of, you know,
you get some street cred.
And street cred, and there's like an entry point, and people like can maybe access it because they understand, they do know what it means to weld, and they might have used it in a more practical application, but at least they can wrap their head around that process.
So to finish up the interview, Amy and I talked a little bit about what she hopes her art can do for people and how it can inspire people to look at the world in new ways, as well as a little bit about what she's working on at the moment.
High up there on my goal of what my art would do if it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is just like getting the viewer into like a place of like, oh, I've never thought of it or looked at it like that before. Like I'm seeing something in a way that's slightly different than maybe I've looked at or seen at other things. And like what? Like I don't get it, or like how am I, like my brain is having to figure this out. And I feel like that's a really rich place for a viewer to be, because if you can do that with art, like you can do that with anything, right? And like, hey, we need to solve climate change. You know what I mean? Like we need to figure out some really important stuff. So.
At the end of our interview, Amy told me that one way that she's engaging with this idea of putting things in a new light or imagining them in a way that's different to how we normally think about things in art and in our world is with the female form, and specifically with these collaged swimmers that she's been working on.
Yeah, like I feel like for me, as a recently having turned 50-year-old woman, and having a body and being an artist, and you know, when I was in art school and thinking, and in grad school and thinking about the women that were my professors, I'm thinking specifically of Mags Harries, who's a Welsh artist who's at the museum school, and others there. They were really on the front lines of like that. They were coming of age as female artists in the 70s, and it's just like they were in it, you know. And it's like they were my teachers. Like we're on a trajectory for women that's still unfolding, you know. Like we're not. And I do think, you know, that generation of the 70s was like, you know, heck, like we burned our bras for you, like we gave it all to you on a platter, you go at it. And yet like there's clearly like now the pendulum swings back, like where did our reproductive rights just go? Poof. So it's like this is still an active conversation. Women's bodies are a battleground, right? So it's like I feel like in a larger sense, like if the grand history, like scope of history of Western art, which has been generally told by men, the woman's body is an object. So it's like now that as women artists we are like forging new territories for ourselves, it's almost incumbent upon us to represent our own bodies. You know, because the figure is always going to make its way into art, right? But it's incumbent upon us to represent ourselves, our bodies,
Yeah.
and being someone who does not like perfectly match up to, you know, the American beauty standard. Like I feel like I am making a body that maybe it doesn't look exactly like mine, but like I want to make a body. Like I want to be part of, like, I don't want somebody else to make a body. Like I want to say, like, this is a body. Like, so I feel like there's a claiming of space for the figure in art by women. And I guess swimming, like I love it's moving through space.
Yeah,
I love to swim.
The subject.
Yeah, I feel so much freedom in the water, you know, and but it's also active.
A freedom, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's really cool.
Thanks.
That was perfect.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much.
Guys, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to Amy for letting me do this interview. It was really, really inspiring, and yeah, I really appreciate it. I had an amazing time. I will link her website down below if you'd like to have a look at more of her work and read more about what she's done. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!